This is my true story. My son disappeared 25 years ago. I buried his memory, not his body. Every night I prayed for a miracle, even when the world told me to stop. I lived with a photograph and an empty chair that never moved. But last week, I saw him, alive, breathing, walking out of a grocery store like a stranger. My knees almost gave out. My heart forgot how to beat. What I learned that day destroyed everything I believed in as a father. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so my story can reach more people. In 1999, my life ended without a funeral. One minute my son was driving home from college, the next he was gone. No accident report, no phone call, nothing left behind except his room and a half-written note on his desk. The police said he might have run away or met with foul play. I heard their words, but none of them made sense. How does a boy just disappear on a clear day? I went to every police station, every hospital, every place where hope usually dies. They filed their papers and moved on. I didn't. I searched highways, fields, and rivers. I knelt in mud, calling his name until my voice broke. People stopped answering my questions because they were tired of seeing my face. I wasn't tired of finding him. When the weeks became months, his mother stopped eating. She waited by the window every night with a lamp lit, thinking he'd see it and come home. I used to hold her hand and say he'd walk through the door any minute. I didn't believe my own words, but I had to give her something to hold on to. One morning I found her collapsed on the floor, her hand still gripping his photo. She died a month later of a broken heart. The doctor wrote another word on the certificate, but I know the truth. She didn't want to wake up in a world where her son was missing. After her funeral, the house turned into a tomb. I left his room exactly as it was, bed unmade, window half open, a pair of shoes under the chair. Sometimes I'd sit on his bed and pretend he was just late. Other times I'd talk to his photograph like he was listening. The neighbors stopped visiting. Friends moved away. I stayed. I couldn't leave the last place where he was real. The years ate my savings. I sold the car, then the furniture, then the land. Every coin went to private investigators who took my money and gave me nothing but shrugs. Each time they said they'd found a lead, I drove miles with hope in my hands and came back with nothing but dust. I remember standing in a morgue once, looking at a body they found by the river. I prayed it was him so I could finally bury him. When they pulled back the sheet and it was someone else, I cried like I'd lost him again. I walked out and threw up on the street because grief and relief together feel like poison. After that day, I stopped asking for updates. The police closed the case, filed it away like a broken toy. They told me to accept that he was dead, but I couldn't. I didn't need proof he was alive. I just couldn't believe that someone so alive could vanish without a trace. Every birthday, I bought a cake for no one. Every Christmas, I set an extra plate that stayed untouched. Neighbors thought I was crazy, but grief doesn't care about dignity. I kept his old car key on a string around my neck. When people asked why, I said, "It's for when he comes home." They smiled sadly like you do for a child who believes in ghosts. I didn't mind. Hope was the only thing I had left. Years turned me gray. My back bent, my hands shook, but I still checked missing person websites every night. I scrolled through faces of the lost and imagined which one might be mine. Sometimes I dreamed of him standing at the door saying, "Dad, I'm home." I always woke up crying because the door was still closed. Even after 20 years, I kept talking to him. I'd tell him how the garden was growing, how the world had changed, how I still missed the sound of his shoes on the porch. The house was quiet, but my mind was noisy with memories. By the 25th year, I was the last one still looking. Everyone else had forgotten his name. But a father doesn't forget. A father waits. He waits even when there's nothing left to wait for. That's what kept me alive. Not hope of finding him, but fear of stopping. Because if I stopped looking, I'd have to accept that my boy was gone forever. And I could never do that. So I lived with my loss like it was a shadow that followed me everywhere. It never left. It just grew darker with time. Grief became my only company. It lived in the chair beside me, in the empty space at the table, in the silence that filled the house after sunset. I woke up every morning expecting nothing and went to bed every night remembering everything. There was no escape, not from the sound of his laughter that echoed in my head, not from the smell of his old jacket still hanging by the door. The house wasn't a home anymore. It was a graveyard of memories. Every wall held a picture. Every picture held a lie I told myself to keep breathing. I told people I was fine. I wasn't. I hadn't been fine since 1999. I remember walking down the streets holding his photo, showing it to strangers who barely looked at me. They'd shake their heads and keep walking, like grief was contagious. Maybe it was. I saw other parents move on, remarry, rebuild. I couldn't. I didn't want to start over. My life had ended the day he vanished. Everything since then was just surviving. I lived in the same town, ate at the same diner we used to visit, sat at the same bench by the park. Sometimes I thought I saw him in the crowd, a flash of his hair, his walk, the shape of his shoulders. I'd run after that shadow, but it always turned into someone else. And each time it did, I lost him all over again. The nights were the worst. That's when grief talks the loudest. I'd sit in his room, read the old books he left behind, touch the toys that still had dust from his childhood. I found an old cassette he once recorded, his voice singing off-key, laughing after every wrong note. I played it again and again until the tape wore out. I wanted to hear his voice one more time, even if it broke me. I wrote him letters every month, even though there was nowhere to send them. I kept them in a box under my bed, hundreds of them, all sealed, all unanswered. I called it my mailbox to heaven. Some nights I went to the police station just to look at his file. The officer stopped me once and said, "You know he's gone, right?" I looked at him and said, "He's only gone when I stop looking." He didn't understand. Nobody did. I didn't need them to. My grief wasn't about logic. It was about love that had nowhere left to go. I'd walk through cemeteries at night, looking at names and wondering which one should have been his. Sometimes I envied those who had graves to cry over. At least they had a place to leave their pain. I had to carry mine everywhere. Years later, when the world moved on, I stopped expecting anyone to care. People forgot his name. But I still said it every day, because saying it made him real. I imagined what he'd look like now. Older, taller, maybe with a family of his own. In my head, he was always smiling. In reality, he was just gone. The weight of that truth crushed everything I was. I stopped celebrating holidays, stopped answering calls, stopped pretending. I was just an old man sitting in the past, waiting for something that would never come. I grew bitter without meaning to. Every time I saw a father and son walking together, I turned away. Not out of hate, but because it hurt too much to see what I lost. My body aged faster than it should have. My hands shook, my vision blurred, but my memory stayed sharp, cruelly sharp. I could still see his face that last morning, waving goodbye, promising he'd be back for dinner. That promise kept me alive for years. Then it became the reason I wished I wasn't. There's a kind of grief that doesn't fade. It just hides behind routine. That was my life. I woke up, ate, breathed, and carried pain like a second skin. It never loosened. It never left. I thought I'd die with it, and maybe I would have, if not for that one moment years later when I saw him again. But before that day, grief was the only thing I had left, and I clung to it because losing it meant losing him completely. And I couldn't bear that. Life after loss is not life. It's survival. Days blend together until you forget what year it is. I woke up because my body remembered how to, not because I wanted to. I ate food that tasted like dust, drank coffee that felt heavy in my hands. The house was too quiet, even the walls seemed tired of me. I stopped opening the curtains because the sunlight made the emptiness sharper. Everything that once had meaning, birthdays, seasons, small joys, turned into reminders of what I didn't have anymore. The world outside laughed, celebrated, moved on, while I stayed frozen in the same moment from 1999. The mornings were the worst. I'd hear the birds singing like they didn't know someone was missing. I'd pour 2 cups of coffee out of habit, then stare at the empty chair across the table. That chair was once his. Now it was just a hollow shape holding invisible memories. I used to sit there for hours, tracing my finger on the wood, remembering the mornings he'd sit there, rushing through breakfast before school, his backpack hanging halfway off his shoulder. I still waited for the sound of that backpack hitting the floor every evening. It never came again. I tried going back to work, but nothing felt real. People asked how I was doing, and I said, "I'm fine." That's what you say when you're dying slowly. I saw their pity. They didn't understand that I didn't want comfort. I wanted my son. I quit after a few months because the noise of the office made me sick. Everyone talked about vacations, promotions, weddings, things I no longer had the right to want. I went home one day, sat in the dark, and never went back. The world had no use for a man waiting for a ghost. At night, the house came alive with sounds that weren't real. I heard footsteps in the hall, the door creak, the fridge open, just like when he used to sneak in for midnight snacks. Sometimes I'd call his name before realizing the noise was only my imagination. I would walk through the house touching the walls, whispering, "I'm still here." I wasn't sure who I was talking to, him, myself, or the echo of what used to be my life. I stopped talking to people. They said time heals. It doesn't. Time just teaches you how to hide pain better. Every time someone said, "He's in a better place," I wanted to scream. I didn't want him in a better place. I wanted him home. I kept his room locked for years. When I finally opened it, dust covered everything, but his smell was still there. I sat on his bed and cried until my throat hurt. I realized I wasn't living anymore, just existing inside his absence. The bus station became my second home. That was the last place he was seen. I went there every year on his birthday and left a card that said, "Happy birthday, son." Dad still waits. Sometimes the cards got taken by strangers or blown away by the wind. I didn't care. It was my way of saying I hadn't given up. People called me crazy. They weren't wrong. Losing a child makes you insane in ways polite words can't describe. One winter, I almost froze sitting on that bench waiting for a sign. My hands were stiff, my coat soaked, but I refused to move. I told myself if I suffered enough, maybe God would bring him back out of pity. But God stayed silent. He always did. I started believing maybe I was being punished for something, some sin I couldn't remember. Maybe this was my hell, and my punishment was to keep breathing without him. I grew old in that silence. Wrinkles came, bones weakened, but my heart stayed stuck at 52, the age I was when he vanished. I never remarried. What would be the point? You can't start a new chapter when you never finished the last one. Friends tried to fix me, to make me smile, but smiles don't grow in dead soil. I learned how to fake one. People stopped asking after a while. They forgot his name, but I didn't. I never will. Even now, I still wake up expecting to hear his voice calling me Dad. The first second after waking, I believe it might happen. The second after that, reality comes back, sharp and cold. That's how grief works. It gives you hope just long enough to hurt you again. And so I kept living, not because I wanted to, but because some part of me still believed that one day I might see him again. Habits are what remain when everything else is gone. When you lose everyone, when love dies, when hope feels too far, your body still wakes up, still breathes, still repeats the same motions as if memory is a machine that refuses to stop. That was my life. I became a man of routine because without it, I would collapse. Every morning I made the same breakfast, read the same newspaper, sat in the same chair by the window, and stared at the road where my son used to ride his bike. I told myself it was just habit, not hope, but deep down I knew I was lying. I was still waiting, even if I didn't want to admit it. After all these years, I had trained myself to live around the emptiness. I still bought his favorite cereal even though he hadn't eaten it in 25 years. I still folded an extra towel when doing laundry, still left the porch light on every night like it could guide him back. People said I was stuck in the past, but how do you leave the past when it's the only place your child exists? The present was just survival. The past was where I could still be a father. I kept going to the same grocery store every Thursday. It was something small, something ordinary, but it made me feel like life still had a rhythm. The cashier knew my name. The workers nodded kindly, probably thinking I was just another lonely old man. They didn't know the truth, that every face I saw, I searched for his. It was automatic. In every crowd, my eyes scanned for him. The tilt of a head, the shape of a nose, the sound of a laugh. I saw pieces of him in strangers, but never him. Still, I couldn't stop looking. It wasn't even hope anymore. It was compulsion, like my heart refused to believe death without a grave. I had a ritual. Every Sunday morning I visited the church, lit a candle for him, and sat in the last pew. I didn't pray anymore. I just watched the flame flicker. Sometimes I imagined he could see it from wherever he was, and maybe that small light would remind him of me. Then I'd walk home slowly, passing by the same park where I taught him to ride a bike. The swings still moved in the wind. I'd sit on the bench, hands folded, watching other children laugh, and for a moment I'd almost smile, until guilt hit me for daring to feel anything but loss. Time aged me faster than I expected. My body weakened, but my memory stayed cruelly sharp. I could still recall his voice, every word, every laugh. I remembered the scar on his chin from when he fell off the tree in our yard. I remembered the day he hugged me after graduation, saying he'd make me proud. That was the last time I touched him. Those memories replayed like broken film reels, familiar, comforting, and painful all at once. I lived inside those loops, too afraid to break them because outside of them there was nothing left. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and check the front door. I don't know why. Maybe because in my dreams he would knock, and I'd wake up believing it was real. I would walk to the door half asleep, hands shaking on the handle, open it to the empty porch, and just stand there until the cold air reminded me where I was. Then I'd close the door and whisper, "Maybe tomorrow." It became my bedtime prayer, even though I'd stopped believing in God a long time ago. That was my life for 25 years, a series of small habits that made no sense to anyone but me. Every breath was a repetition of waiting. Every movement was a reminder of what was missing. People think grief is about tears and sadness, but it's not. It's about routine, the quiet rituals that keep you from falling apart. My habits were my anchor, my curse, and my only way to pretend I was still alive. And then, on one ordinary afternoon, in the middle of one of those habits, everything changed. I went to buy bread, just like every other week, and saw the face I had been searching for half my life. It happened on a day that should have meant nothing. Just another ordinary afternoon. I had gone to the grocery store like I always did. My knees hurt, the air was cold, and I only wanted to buy bread and milk. I pushed the cart slowly down the aisle, nodding to the cashier who always smiled out of habit. Nothing felt special. It was just another loop in my small, empty life. But as I walked out with my bag of groceries, the world stopped moving. There was a man coming out of the next door, tall, thin, wearing a dark coat and a cap pulled low. He carried a paper bag full of groceries. I don't know what made me look at him twice, but I did. Maybe it was the way he walked, a certain slouch in the shoulders, a rhythm I had seen 1,000 times when he was young. My heart jumped so hard I thought I might collapse. Then I saw it, the scar above his right eyebrow, a thin white line. I knew that scar. I gave him that scar the day he fell off his bike and hit the gate when he was 10. I froze. The world around me blurred. People moved past like shadows, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My hands began to shake, the grocery bag slipping from my fingers. The sound of it hitting the ground snapped him out of his walk. He looked up. For a moment, his eyes met mine. Just a second. But that second carried 25 years of waiting, praying, breaking. His face was older, sharper, with lines of a life I hadn't seen. But those eyes, they were his, my son's eyes, the same color, the same look he had when he was small and asked for help with his homework. My voice wouldn't work. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My chest felt tight, like it might split open. I whispered his name, barely a sound, but he heard it. His body stiffened. His face went pale. He turned his head slightly, like he was deciding whether to run or speak. Then his lips trembled, not in surprise, but in guilt. He knew me. He recognized me instantly. For a moment, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. Not fear of danger, but of truth catching up after years of running. He looked at me like a man staring at a ghost. Maybe that's what I was to him, a reminder of everything he left behind. My knees weakened, and I reached out my hand as if I could touch him from across that small space. But before I could take a step, he turned away. Just like that. No word, no gesture, no hug. He walked faster, pushing through the crowd. I stumbled after him, calling his name again, louder this time. People turned their heads, but he didn't. He just kept walking, his shoulders tense, his steps quick. The noise of the street faded. I could only hear my heartbeat, loud and broken. I tried to follow, but my legs were heavy, my breath uneven. Still, I ran, or something close to it. I didn't care who was watching. I didn't care about the pain in my chest. All I saw was the back of his head, that same head I once kissed goodnight. I kept calling out until my voice cracked. He stopped for a moment at the corner, half turned, like he was going to say something. Our eyes met one last time. He shook his head slowly, then crossed the street and disappeared into the crowd. I stood there for a long time, gasping, trembling, not knowing if I should cry or laugh or fall to the ground. 25 years of searching, and when I finally found him, he didn't want to be found. I waited outside the store until the lights went out, hoping he might come back. He never did. When I finally went home that night, I sat in the dark and tried to convince myself it was a dream. But my heart knew better. I had seen him. He was alive. My son, the one I buried only in my mind, was alive, walking the same streets as me. But for some reason, he didn't want me in his world anymore. That moment broke something in me that grief hadn't touched. Losing him once was pain. Seeing him alive and walking away, that was cruelty. Real, human cruelty. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't erase the look in his eyes when he saw me. It wasn't love. It wasn't hate. It was something colder. The look of someone who had already decided to forget you. I walked home that night like a man half alive. The cold air stung my face, but I barely felt it. My mind kept replaying those 2 seconds. His eyes, the way he looked at me, the way he turned away like I was nothing but a shadow from a life he didn't want anymore. I sat on my couch in silence for hours, still holding the torn grocery bag I'd picked up from the street. The bread was crushed, the milk had spilled, but I didn't move. My body was there, but my soul was stuck back at that store door, frozen in the moment when my son, my lost boy, looked at me and chose to walk away. It took me all night to accept that it was real. It wasn't a dream. He wasn't dead. He hadn't been kidnapped or lost or taken. He had left, by choice. He had built another life while I was busy dying every day in the same empty house. That truth was colder than any grave. It was the kind of pain you can't bury because it stays breathing next to you. I realized that all those years I had prayed for his safety, for his return, for God to watch over him. He had been alive somewhere, maybe laughing, maybe eating dinner with people who called him by a different name. While I searched hospitals and filed reports, he was walking in the sun. While I lit candles and begged for answers, he was building a new world where I didn't exist. That thought made my chest hurt in a way no doctor could cure. The police never found anything because there was nothing to find. No accident, no tragedy. Just a man who walked away from his life and never looked back. I used to think he was my missing piece. But maybe I was just his past. Something he outgrew. I was his father once, but not anymore. The man I saw outside that grocery store wasn't my boy. He had his face, his eyes, his scar, but his soul, that belonged to another world now. I thought of all the years I'd wasted sitting by the phone, jumping every time a number I didn't know appeared on the screen. I thought of the nights I stayed awake wondering if he was cold, hungry, hurt. The irony made me sick. He wasn't hurting, I was. And I had done it to myself, loving a son who decided love was too heavy to carry. I couldn't hate him. That's the cruelest part. I wanted to, but I couldn't. I tried to imagine him as a stranger, but my heart refused. Every part of me was built around being his father. Take that away, and what was left? Just an old man sitting alone in a house full of ghosts. I realized that all the grief I carried wasn't just sadness. It was purpose. Searching for him gave me something to live for. Now that I had found him, and he didn't want to be found, even that purpose was gone. I understood something that night. Losing someone to death is pain, but losing them to choice is cruelty. Death is final. You can make peace with it. But knowing they're out there, alive, breathing, laughing, and choosing a life without you, that's a wound that never heals. That's the kind of hurt that eats your insides quietly while the world thinks you're fine. When I closed my eyes that night, I saw his face again, older, harder, unfamiliar. I whispered his name into the dark and waited for a reply that would never come. The clock ticked, the house groaned, the world kept moving. But inside me, everything stopped. That was the moment I realized the truth. I hadn't lost my son in 1999. I had lost him long before that. I just didn't want to see it. The moment he turned away, something inside me broke loose. Something older than pain, stronger than fear. My legs moved before my mind could think. I left my groceries on the sidewalk and started after him. The crowd was thick, but I didn't care. People stared as I stumbled past, calling his name again and again. It didn't sound like a name anymore. More like a prayer tearing its way out of my chest. He kept walking fast, his head low, his steps uneven. I could tell he was fighting himself. Part of him wanted to run, part of him wanted to look back. The city noise drowned my voice, but I didn't stop. I followed him down the street, across the lights, into the next block. Every few steps, he looked over his shoulder, not enough to meet my eyes, just enough to make sure I was still behind him. I was. My lungs burned, my knees screamed, but I couldn't stop. I had waited 25 years for this, for any sign of him, and I wasn't letting him disappear again. Not without hearing his voice, not without knowing why. He turned into an alley, narrow and quiet. The world felt smaller there, just the two of us and the echo of my footsteps. He stopped halfway through, his back to me. I froze, breathing hard, my chest tight. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, without turning around, he said softly, "You shouldn't have come." His voice was low, familiar, calm, but cold. The sound of it hit me like a blow. That voice had once called me Dad. That voice used to fill my house with laughter. Now it sounded like it belonged to a stranger. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but nothing came out. My throat was dry. My body trembled. I took a step closer, reaching out as if I could still bring him home by touching his shoulder. But he stepped forward instead, away from me. That small movement hurt more than any word. It told me everything. He didn't want to be found. He didn't want me. He didn't want the life he had before. He turned then, slowly, and I finally saw his face clearly in the light. The boy I lost was gone. In his place stood a man I didn't recognize. His eyes were colder, harder, the lines around his mouth deeper. He looked like someone who had seen too much and cared too little. Yet behind that hardness, I saw something else. Shame. He looked at me the way a man looks at a grave he dug himself. I asked with my eyes what my voice couldn't. Why? Why did you leave? Why did you let me bury you in my mind for 25 years? He didn't answer, just stared for a moment, swallowed hard, and said again, quieter this time, "You shouldn't have come." And then he turned his back on me for the second time in one lifetime. I tried to move, to follow, but my body gave out. I leaned against the wall, gasping, the pain in my chest spreading like fire. The sound of his footsteps faded. I wanted to call out, but the words got stuck in my throat. When I finally stepped out of the alley, he was gone, just like before, just like 1999. I stood there for a long time, looking at the street that had swallowed him. Cars passed, people walked, life went on, as if the world didn't just reopen an old wound in front of me. The air smelled of rain and dust. I realized then that you can lose the same person twice. Once when they leave, and once when they come back and still choose to walk away. I walked home slower that time. Every step felt heavier, like I was dragging 25 years behind me. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My tears had run dry years ago. But inside, something hollowed out, leaving only silence. I had found my son, and he had found his way out of my life. Again. When I finally saw him again, it wasn't in a dream or by accident. It was fate's cruel joke, the universe giving me one more chance only to twist the knife deeper. I had followed him that day, trembling, desperate for answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. He stopped near an old bench behind the grocery store, where the noise of traffic faded into quiet. For a few seconds, we stood there. Two strangers with the same blood running through our veins, two lives separated by 25 years of lies. He turned slowly, and the look in his eyes told me the truth before his mouth ever spoke it. There was no fear of me, no shock, only shame. I asked him, barely above a whisper, why he did it, why he left, why he let me die every day waiting for him. His face hardened. He said the words I will never forget. He told me he didn't disappear by accident. He had chosen it. He had faked his own disappearance. The air left my lungs. I couldn't even process it at first. He said he was drowning in debt back then, gambling, bad friends, wrong choices. He had borrowed money from the wrong people, people who wanted him dead. Instead of facing it, he drove away one night and left everything, his car, his name, his family. He said he couldn't live with the shame of failure, that he was tired of being the perfect son I wanted him to be. He changed his name, moved to another city, started over. He told me he had a wife now, children who knew nothing about his old life. He said he built something stable this time, a small job, a quiet home. And he said, with eyes that didn't dare meet mine, that he had no place for me in that new world. He said it like it was a fact, not cruelty, but it felt like being buried alive. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him, to tell him that all I ever wanted was for him to live, to be happy, to come home. But the words died in my throat. He kept talking, and every word cut deeper. He said the police search was too close, that he'd watched me from a distance once, just to make sure I'd moved on. You were better off thinking I was gone, he said. It was easier that way. Easier. For him, maybe. Not for me. Not for the father who sold his house, who begged strangers for help, who stood outside police stations holding a photo until the faces behind the desks changed and the years rolled over. He told me he was sorry, but the kind of sorry that means nothing. The kind people say when they just want the conversation to end. I asked if his wife knew about me. He shook his head. It's better if she doesn't. He said his children thought their grandfather died long ago. He didn't want to confuse them. Didn't want to open old wounds. Old wounds. He said it like mine had healed. He didn't understand that my wound never closed, that I carried his ghost in my heart every single day. I realized then that the man in front of me wasn't my son anymore. He had my son's face, my son's voice, but the boy I raised was gone. The one who used to hold my hand, who used to laugh when I called him champ, who once said, "I'll take care of you when you're old." That boy died the night he drove away. What was left was someone else. Someone who didn't need me, who didn't even want to remember me. He looked at me one last time and said, "Please don't follow me again." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog like a memory being erased. I didn't chase him. I didn't call his name. I just stood there and watched the world take him from me again. The truth finally settled in my chest, heavy and sharp. My son hadn't been taken from me. He had given himself away. That was the day I stopped asking questions. Some truths don't heal. They just teach you how deep love can cut when it's one-sided. When he walked away that second time, it didn't feel like anger. It felt like dying quietly while standing up. My body stayed frozen long after he disappeared into the fog. I could still hear his footsteps fading, each one hammering deeper into my chest. 25 years of waiting, praying, and punishing myself had all led to this. A goodbye without meaning. I didn't even cry. The tears had turned to dust inside me years ago. What came instead was a slow collapse from the inside, a breaking that didn't make noise. I went home in silence. The streets looked the same, but nothing around me felt real anymore. I opened the door to my small apartment and stood there for a long time, staring at the empty chair where I used to imagine him sitting. I used to picture him coming back one day, knocking on the door, smiling shyly, saying he was sorry. I used to think I'd hold him, forgive him, tell him nothing else mattered. But now, knowing he had chosen to leave me, to erase me, even that dream was dead. The house felt smaller that night. Even the air was heavier. I sat at the kitchen table and took out the old photo album. The pages were worn, the corners bent. His baby pictures, his school awards, his first bike. All pieces of a life that once meant everything. I traced my fingers over his face, remembering how proud I was the day he graduated. I used to tell everyone my son would make something great of himself. I guess he did, just not with me in it. Every page of that album felt like a lie now, proof of a story that ended long before I realized it. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, not the one I raised, but the one from the grocery store, older, sharper, and so full of guilt it almost looked like hate. I wondered if he ever thought about me, if he ever told his children about the man who taught him to walk, who stayed up at night fixing his school projects, who sold his car to pay for his tuition. Maybe he told them I was dead. Maybe that made it easier for him to live. For days after that, I walked around like a ghost in my own life. People at the park still nodded when I passed, but I barely saw them. I had built my whole existence around the hope of seeing him again, and when I finally did, it destroyed what was left of me. It's a strange kind of pain, when the thing you prayed for finally happens, and it ends up being worse than the waiting. The silence in my house grew heavier with each day. The phone never rang. The world didn't care that a father's heart had cracked open again. I tried to keep busy, watering the plants, cleaning, pretending that routine could fill the emptiness. But everything reminded me of him. The way he used to slam the door, the way he'd hum songs while doing chores, even the chair he broke when he was 16. Those memories used to warm me. Now they just hurt. A week later, I went back to that grocery store. I stood outside for hours, hoping maybe he'd come again. He didn't. I asked the cashier if she'd seen a man fitting his description. She shook her head politely. I thanked her and left, pretending I wasn't breaking all over again. The world had swallowed him once more, and I didn't have the strength to chase him again. That night, I realized something cruel. Maybe love isn't about holding on. Maybe it's about knowing when you've been erased and walking away before you erase yourself too. I turned off the lights, sat in the dark, and whispered his name one last time. The sound of it echoed off the walls like it didn't belong there anymore. That was the night I let go. Not because I wanted to, but because there was nothing left to hold. It has been months since that day at the grocery store, but the moment still replays in my mind like an unfinished movie. I can see his face every time I close my eyes. Older, colder, filled with a kind of sadness that looked permanent. I don't know if he ever thinks of me, but I think of him every day. Some mornings, I wake up expecting to hear his voice calling me for breakfast, and then I remember that those sounds belong to a different lifetime. That's how grief works. It doesn't stop. It just learns to live quietly inside you. I still go to the same store once a week. I buy the same loaf of bread and the same carton of milk. The cashier doesn't ask questions anymore. She just gives me a soft smile, the kind people give when they see someone still looking for something that's long gone. I walk out slowly, scanning every face that passes by, hoping one day he'll be there again. Not to talk, not to explain, just to exist within reach. Maybe that's all I want now. Proof that he still breathes under the same sky. The neighbors think I'm strange. They see me waiting at the corner, sitting at the same bench, eyes fixed on the street. Some have stopped trying to talk to me. Others whisper when I walk by. "He's still waiting for his son," they say. And maybe they're right. Waiting has become the only thing I know how to do. I waited when he was gone, and now I wait knowing he's alive, but gone in a different way. By choice. That kind of absence cuts deeper because it's chosen, not forced. At night, the apartment feels heavier than ever. The clock ticks louder. The air feels thicker. I sit by the window, watching the world move on without me. Families laugh, couples argue, children play. Life goes on. But mine stopped somewhere between 1999 and now. Sometimes I talk to him quietly, the way I used to when he was little and scared of thunder. I tell him I forgive him, even though he'll never hear it. Maybe forgiveness isn't about the other person. Maybe it's about trying to make peace with your own heart. I've thought about writing him a letter, but I don't know where to send it. He said he had a new name, a new life. What would I even write? Your father still breathes, but barely. Your ghost still lives in me. I wouldn't ask him to come back. That would be selfish. I just wish he would tell me he's doing fine, that he's happy, that my pain wasn't for nothing. But even that small mercy feels too much to ask. Some nights, I take out the old shoebox under my bed. It's filled with things from his childhood, a broken toy car, his first school report card, the photo of him holding the dog we rescued. I look at them and realize that love doesn't disappear just because the person does. It stays, heavy and constant, like an anchor keeping you tied to what once was. People say time heals. They lie. Time doesn't heal. It just teaches you how to breathe around the wound. Sometimes I dream of him. In those dreams, he's still young, still smiling, still calling me Dad. I wake up reaching for that sound, and when I realize it's gone, it feels like losing him all over again. But I don't hate him. I can't. Hate would mean there's still energy left to fight. What I feel is emptiness, the kind that doesn't fade, only settles deeper. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see an old man who's outlived his purpose. But maybe my purpose was never to be found. Maybe it was to love him, even if it destroyed me. Every Friday, I still walk past that grocery store, hoping for a glimpse. Not because I expect anything, but because hope, even when it hurts, is all I have left. And if I ever see him again, I won't ask him to come home. I'll just say, "I never stopped waiting, son." And maybe that will be enough, even if it's the last thing he ever hears from me.